I don't think that's really appropriate. Not with Sheila here.
Nonsense, Mummy.
She's heard a lot worse than that.
Have you?
You know I have.
Altogether excellent dinner. You must tell cook from me, Sybil.
And you're not supposed to say such things in front of guests.
In trouble again.
This is a dream cast. We could not imagine a more exciting team to be bringing it to life. It's a fantastic play, literary classic, and such an important piece of British theatre history.
Inspector Gould, sir.
Mr. Berlin.
When you approach any play and try and do an adaptation, the first thing you have to realise is this is a screen version, not a theatric version. I think TV also is very much a kind of a world of realism and social realism. So in our adaptation, we have looked at that aspect and tried to make it as sort of real as possible. I mean, obviously it's a very contemporary play in its themes, but in terms of language, we wanted it to kind of hit through and really feel that you are, yes, watching a family in 1912, but also watching a family now.
What's the matter with you?
I don't know. Sorry, I just...
He's squiffy.
It spoke to me a lot about socialism and looking after one another and responsibility and greed and all of those things that I'm quite interested in telling stories about. The reason that it's still on the GCSE syllabus is because of that, because it makes, whatever age one is, 14 or 15, look at those themes and examine what is it to take responsibility for oneself and others. What is it to live in the world? What is it to understand greed and, you know, being selfish?
The morality of the piece can give rise to lots of interesting questions for discussion. I think that there's characters in there which they can all relate to. You know, there's a young man, Eric, who's obviously on the verge of rebellion, is feeling really, really unsettled and unhappy and crushed by his family and the weight of his parents' expectations. And then there's Sheila, who's, you know, a young girl who's about to get engaged and sort of embark on a new chapter in her life. And I think that very cleverly the things that all the different characters do, they don't feel sort of completely out of touch with reality.
I'd never do it again, not to anyone.
It's all right now.
One of the joys of the process of doing Inspector Calls is actually meeting J.B. Priestley's son, Tom. And I think he's probably seen more productions of an Inspector Calls than any living soul. And so he's a great sort of person to talk to.
He was a man who always had ideas, and he jotted down in a little black book, Inspector visits family, or words to that effect. An old friend of his had invited him to lecture about the theatre, and then, in chatting, said, what happened about that idea of yours about the inspector? And that just clicked. So he went away and wrote it. And that was the autumn of 1944. And it was only afterwards he'd realised how cleverly he'd fitted it together and got the entrances and exits and the curtains. At that time, there was no London theatre available. So he'd had connections with Russia and was very interested in the Russian people.
He had a lot of work translated in Russia. He had a Russian translator, so naturally he sent it to the Russian translator. And it was done, I think, in Moscow and in Leningrad before it was done in London. Right-wing critics thought this was a sign of some sinister red plot, you know, that Priestley was writing communist propaganda. Not at all. It was simply he wanted the play staged as quickly as possible, and the Soviet theatres were the ones that were immediately available. The first time it was done in the UK was at the Old Vic, when they were at the New Theatre, and it was then a kind of embryonic national theatre led by Laurence Olivier and Ralph Richardson.
Yes, Inspector Calls was written for Ralph Richardson to play the inspector. It had poor reviews, not just since they didn't like it, but they chose not to understand it or to appreciate it.
I think it was because people couldn't quite categorise it. They didn't quite know how to place it. But what is fascinating is how instantly the play was picked up by the regional repertory companies and the amateur theatre companies, and it's and done on the radio a lot and then on television, and it's never fallen out of fashion in the years since, because it obviously says something that we all recognise.
She was part of a gang of 5. They started coming to me that summer. Wanted me to put the wages up. I refused. Next thing I knew, she'd brought the whole workforce out on strike.
I heard about that.
He went back to 1912 because it was before the First World War. And for him, for everyone of his generation, the First World War and the experience of it changed them and life totally. He was very conscious that after the First World War, things sort of slipped back to the way they'd been before, and the old establishment was there running things. And when the war began, my father was busy in London, particularly with his broadcasts.
In that magnificent summer of 1940, when I spent my days collecting information and my nights broadcasting it to the world beyond the ring of steel around us, I think I felt better than ever before or since. We lived at last in a community with a noble common purpose, and the experience was not only novel, but exhilarating.
He was one of the few BBC broadcasters who actually had a regional accent. You know, the BBC voice was sort of very plumb and proper at the time. But I think that added strength to him. He was an ordinary person speaking to ordinary people. He was, as it were, talking to equals. That we're all in this together, and this is how we're feeling about it. You could say that the support led to the huge Labour victory in 1945, when you might expect sentimentally that Churchill, as the great hero who saved the nation, would have been voted back. And he wasn't. He was voted out because people wanted something different.
And of course that was one of the great betrayals that Churchill felt, was actually even the soldiers themselves wanted a different world. They wanted a land fit for heroes, and a belief and a faith in a land fit for heroes that actually was delivered this time, as opposed to the failure after the First World War. So here was this romantic idea of what Britain should be again, the building of a welfare state, Britain that should have a new morality. And here was a play trying to talk about, well, what sort of world do we want to live in? What sort of country do we want? Do we want to be returned to these Edwardian values that people are telling us that this is the country we should live in? Or do we want to be starting moving forward with a whole new agenda about what society is and what individuals are and what our responsibility is? And created a character of the inspector, half avenging angel, half therapist, who comes in to try to solve the problem of this conundrum about this missing girl, this girl who apparently has committed suicide. You know, all these things are to be really understood finally by the viewer and the audience to make their own minds up.
You know, in many ways, this is a sort of Downton Abbey, the mystery. And so it's quite important, we felt, to sort of see the staff, to see this house at the beginning almost like a doll's house, which is preparing for this special event, and see the people who actually work there. And they talk about a factory. We kind of wanted to see that, and we wanted to kind of broaden our canvas. But I think the key thing that we did, and the key thing that we decided to do from the outset, is personify Eva and have an emotional connection with her.
How are you coping?
All right, thank you.
Are you? You've lost those roses in your cheeks.
I think it's important that the audience meet her and connect with her and engage with her, because what I think is so brilliant about the piece is that it's fiercely political and it has this sort of ardent socialist undertone. But the reason that it has endured and that people engage with it and connect with it like audiences do is because at the end of the day it's a story. That's the best way to to speak to people, draw people in with a story, they're much more likely to take the message away with them. And I think that's what this piece does. And I think by meeting Eva, you're very much on her side. You have something to connect to, and the story just is more clear. And you sort of think about the political undertones afterwards, perhaps.
3 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd taken steps to end her own life. Her name was Eva Smith.
Eva Smith.
I wanted to maintain some of the sort of mystery around Eva and some of the sense that in a way she could be any girl, one of, hundreds of thousands of girls. I think in terms of the emotional pull on the audience and the audience really understanding the repercussions of what the characters do, it seemed a really good chance for us to just get to know her a little bit more and to empathise with her. Really, her story is still very much told through what the characters relate about their dealings with her.
Let's start again. What's your name?
Alice Gray.
And why have you come to us for help, Miss Gray?
I really wanted the audience to feel for Eva. I wanted them to feel sad at the end. I want them to be close to tears, not to take away from the sort of political edge of the thing, but I think to reinforce it in a way. It's a play about people suffering because of what other people do and how we're all interrelated.
I mean, an interesting feature of the play is that the two characters who are most affected by the revelations are the two young people, Sheila and Eric. So they then speak for and to young people. I think that young people have that kind of moral attitude to life.
Eric.
I'll do anything to stop myself from turning into another one of them.
All they care about is covering this up.
I hope there is a war. I hope it finishes them.
When they find out that the inspector is an imposter, it's nice that Eric and Sheila are together thinking that doesn't change anything. As far as we're concerned, the girl is still dead. And then when they find out the girl isn't dead, it still doesn't change anything. It doesn't change anything at all. We've still treated this girl so badly, and it still all makes sense, and it all still fits together too well for it to not bother us.
I think she immediately feels, oh my God, like, what have I done? And I think it's a very kind of big moment for her, because I don't think she's the sort of person that is used to upsetting people or has ever done anything like that before. I think it's quite a big event for her. The guilt ratchets up, because she very quickly, she's not defensive for very long. She's kind of like, oh, I didn't know, and I wouldn't do it again. I wouldn't do it. She immediately is thinking towards the future of like, I'd never do this again. I'd never do this again, which is a bit different from how her mother and father react.
Sybil, for the first time in her life, understands something about insecurity and real fear, and that it's not just the standards of society that she's feeling she has betrayed. She goes from a point of not feeling that she has done anything wrong to understanding how wrong this is through her children's eyes.
It doesn't change anything. Of course it does. It doesn't.
We went down a slightly more realistic route with the inspector. I really feel today, to go on that journey, he's got to exist in that room during the course of the piece. And then it's, when he leaves the dining room and, disappears off into the night, and they start to question, is he real? Who was he? What was he? That we then start to do the same thing. And for me, he is, many things, their conscience, force from outside that comes in, and somehow related to that girl. He's there for her, He's there to ask the questions that she can no longer ask, and have them answered.
Look, there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business. You know, at least not as far as I'm concerned. It's perfectly straightforward.
What was?
I discharged her, that's all. I discharged her from the works.
Why did you do that, sir?
The inspector probably represents a conscience that's kind of bubbled up over a stovetop, something that's been left on a burner, something you've been trying to keep a lid on. All these people have tried to keep a lid on their secrets, and I think it's gotten too pressurized and too heated, and it's all of a sudden burst through the surface.
Soon after his appearance, we begin to suspect that his agenda is maybe a little more complex and that his modus operandi is a little more unorthodox than a regular inspector, and we start to see him as a much more enigmatic, mysterious character.
There is no Inspector Gould. No one knew at the Bromley Force at all. The inspector represents our conscience. I think it's as simple and as straightforward as that. And our conscience must tell us that we are doing something well or badly, rightly or wrongly. And I think this story illustrates what happens, what can happen if you do things badly, if you behave badly, if you do things that are wrong. The girl has died. Suicide. The police inspector is on his way to ask us some questions.
I think the key fact about an inspector course and the reason why it is still done all the time is that it's about things that matter, i.e. collective guilt and collective responsibility. What is the play saying? It's saying that we, all of us, every one of us, is in some way guilty or responsible for someone else's misfortunes. We may not actively seek this, but through casualness or negligence or indifference, we do damage to other human beings. To put it very simply, Margaret Thatcher famously said in the 1980s, there is no such thing as society. And the whole point of Priestley's play is that there is such a thing as society. And that's what Inspector Gould says in that famous speech, when he says that we are all tied together, we're all members one of another, and we have to acknowledge that. That is the real reason why the play is still done.
We don't live alone upon this earth. We are responsible for each other. If mankind will not learn that lesson, then the time will come soon when he will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish.
It's a good play to study because there's lots of question for the audience, whether it's the real audience in the theatre or for students reading it, where again you have to make up your mind, who is the inspector, what is his agenda, is there a real Eva Smith, is there not a real Eva Smith, how much is known, how much is not known, is he making it up, is he not making it up, all sorts of good mystery questions that you can solve, because in the end it is if you like, a murder mystery. But more than that, it's a morality play which really analyses and tries to question the basis of the morality of the society we're currently living in. And I think that still survives against the morality we're living in now, as it was in 1945 when J.B. Priestley wrote it.
I think it's a play that needs to be revived for every generation, because I think the message never goes away. It'd be wonderful if this play became irrelevant to our society. But as long as we live in a very divided world, a world of selfish individualism, then Priestley's play will always be topical, it seems to me. And what is fascinating is how it is always being rediscovered by young people and say, my goodness, what it says is true.
We're all these people, we've all committed these things, not to say we're all responsible for someone taking their own life, although there's never any way any one of us could ever know such a thing. Everybody on this earth is responsible in some part for someone else's unhappiness, and often profoundly so. I'm sure everyone watching this, if they search their own conscience, has contributed someone's deep unhappiness in some careless, thoughtless, selfish way, some error of judgment, some flaw in their own character, some impatience. That message is a message for all time, and that's what I believe is sustained. I think there's something just deep in that we all can look at each one of these characters and spot at least one of them that we can relate to.
If, seeing the play, you are moved and excited, it has worked. Now, whether you then come out and want to change the world